Close your eyes if you are somewhere safe to do so, or simply let your gaze soften, unfocused, resting on whatever is in front of you without really seeing it. Take one breath that is longer than your usual breath. Not forced, not performed, simply a little more intentional than the breathing you have been doing without noticing it all day. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is supporting it right now. The chair, the floor, the ground beneath all of it, solid and patient and entirely undemanding of anything from you. You do not have to arrive at this moment in any particular state. You do not have to have had a good day, or a productive one, or a day in which you felt like the person you are trying to be. You only have to be here, which you already are. That is enough. That has always been enough, even on the days when it did not feel like nearly enough at all. The Buddha once said something that teachers have been returning to for 25 centuries, because it remains, despite its simplicity, one of the hardest things for a human being to truly absorb. He said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Not more than others, not at the expense of others, but as much as, equal to. The same love you extend so readily to the people you care about, the same patience, the same forgiveness, the same willingness to begin again, that belongs to you as well. Not as a reward for getting it right, not as something to be earned at the end of a long process of improvement. Right now, as you are, already." Today's story is about how difficult that is to believe. It is about a woman named Clara who spent the better part of her adult life holding herself to a standard that she would never have applied to anyone she loved. It is about the particular exhaustion of being your own harshest critic in a world that already has enough critics. It is about what a long walk in the rain, an unlikely conversation, and a very small ceramic bowl taught her about the difference between the pursuit of excellence and the punishment of imperfection. And it is, underneath all of that, a story about a Japanese art form called Kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold, and about why the Buddha's teaching on compassion begins not in temples or meditation halls, but in the ordinary, unwitnessed moments when we look at ourselves clearly and choose, perhaps for the first time, not to flinch. Clara was a translator by profession, a meticulous one, with a gift for finding in one language the precise emotional texture of something said in another. She worked from 4 languages and into 3, and she was good at her work in the way that people are good at things when the work requires a quality they already have in excess. In her case, an almost painful sensitivity to nuance, to the exact shade of meaning that separates one word from another, the specific weight of a silence in one culture versus another. She noticed everything. She felt everything. And for most of her life, she had turned that same precise, unsparing attention on herself with a thoroughness that left very little room for rest. She was 44 when she first walked into the Buddhist meditation center on the edge of the university district, and she was not there because she had been searching for something. She was there because it was raining heavily. She had left her umbrella somewhere she could not remember, and the center's door was open, and there was warm light inside. She stood in the entrance for a moment, dripping, feeling foolish, and a young volunteer handed her a towel without making anything of it. And that small kindness, unearned, unremarkable, entirely without expectation of anything in return, undid her in a way she had not anticipated. She stayed for the evening, sitting. She sat in the back on a chair rather than a cushion, still slightly damp, not knowing what to do with her hands, watching the other people in the room settle into stillness with an ease that seemed to her both foreign and faintly enviable. The teacher that evening was a woman named Sylvia, middle-aged, with the particular quality of someone who had made a long peace with herself and was simply living in it. She spoke without notes, without performance, in the conversational register of someone who finds the subject genuinely interesting and trusts the audience to keep up. Sylvia said that first evening something that Clara wrote down afterward on the back of a receipt she found in her pocket. The harshest judgment in most people's lives is not the one that comes from outside. It is the one that runs constantly, quietly, just below the level of conscious thought, in the voice we mistake for honesty because it is so familiar. We call it standards. We call it self-awareness. We call it not letting ourselves off the hook. But a great deal of what we call high standards is simply cruelty that has learned to use respectable language. Clara sat with that on the walk home. The rain had eased to a fine mist by then, and felt the truth of it in the specific physical way that true things sometimes land. Not as a thought, but as a recognition, something the body knew before the mind caught up. She had been calling it standards for 20 years. She had been calling it the pursuit of excellence. She had been calling it not being complacent, not settling, not becoming someone who makes excuses. And some of it was that, but a great deal of it, she began to suspect on that wet walk home, was something else entirely. She returned the following week, and the week after that. Sylvia taught in the Theravada tradition, the oldest surviving school of Buddhist practice, and she taught it with a rigor and a warmth that Clara found immediately trustworthy. None of the vagueness she had expected, none of the performed serenity that she might have been too skeptical to sit with. Sylvia had opinions. She corrected imprecision. She asked questions that did not have comfortable answers. Clara, who worked in precision for a living, found this unexpectedly reassuring. One evening, Sylvia spoke about Metta, the Pali word usually translated as loving kindness, though Sylvia was careful to note that this translation was imperfect, as most translations of emotional states are. She said that Metta was better understood as a quality of goodwill, a genuine wish for the well-being of others, unconditioned by whether they deserve it, unconditioned by whether they are grateful for it, unconditioned by anything outside of the choice to extend it. And she said what the Buddha had said, what teachers in this tradition have always said, which is that the practice of metta must begin with oneself. Not because oneself is the most important, not because self-love is the goal, but because a well that is dry has nothing to offer anyone who comes to it thirsty. Clara listened carefully, as she always did, and then went home and tried the practice as instructed, sitting quietly, repeating the traditional phrases, "May I be happy, may I be well, may I be safe, may I be at peace," and found within approximately 90 seconds that she could not do it, not because the words were wrong, but because she did not believe them, not for herself. She could wish them for others without difficulty, for the people she loved, for strangers on the street, for people she had never met and would never meet. But directed inward, the phrases felt hollow in the way that a compliment feels hollow when you are certain the person giving it has not looked carefully enough. She told Sylvia this the following week, in the brief conversation after the sitting that Sylvia made available to anyone who wanted it. She said, "I can do the practice for everyone else. I cannot do it for myself. It does not feel true." Sylvia looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has heard a version of this many times and has not grown impatient with it. Then she said, "What you are describing is not a failure of the practice. It is the practice showing you exactly where the work is. The resistance you feel when you try to extend goodwill to yourself, that is not evidence that you do not deserve it. It is evidence of how long you have believed that you do not deserve it. Those are very different things." She paused, then added, "The Buddha taught that the cause of suffering is not the wound itself, but our relationship to it. The same is true of self-compassion. It is not that you are unworthy of care. It is that you have built, over many years, a very convincing case for your own unworthiness, and you have grown so accustomed to the case that you have stopped noticing you are still arguing it." Clara walked home slowly that night, thinking about the case. She knew it well. She had been building it her whole professional life, adding to it with every deadline she had missed, every translation she had submitted feeling it was not quite right, every moment in which she had caught herself being less than the version of herself she was always trying to be. The case was long and detailed, and she was its most diligent contributor. She thought about a cup she had broken the previous month, a ceramic one she had bought years ago in a small shop while traveling, one of the few objects she owned for its beauty rather than its usefulness. She had knocked it from the shelf while reaching for something else, and it had fallen and broken into 4 clean pieces. She had put the pieces in a paper bag and put the bag in a drawer because she could not throw it away and did not know how to fix it. She thought about the cup in the drawer. She thought about what Sylvia had said. The following Saturday, she looked up pottery repair and found in the results, alongside various practical adhesives and professional restoration services, a reference to Kintsugi. the Japanese art of repairing broken ceramics with lacquer mixed with gold dust, so that the repaired object is not merely restored to its former state, but transformed, the breaks made visible and celebrated rather than hidden, the history of breaking made part of the beauty of the object rather than a flaw to be concealed. She read about this for a long time. She found examples, photographs of bowls and cups and plates whose cracks ran through them like rivers of gold. The breakage so visible and so deliberately honored that the repaired objects were considered more beautiful than the unbroken ones had been, because they contained their own history, because they told the truth about what had happened to them and had been made, by that truth, into something richer than they were before. She thought about the cup in the drawer. She thought about herself. She returned to the meditation center on a Tuesday evening when there was no formal sitting, only an open practice period and the possibility of conversation with whoever was there. Sylvia was there, as she often was, and Clara told her about Kintsugi. She said, "I have been thinking about this Japanese practice of repairing broken things with gold, and I wonder if this is what you mean when you talk about self-compassion. Not going back to some unbroken state, not pretending the breaks did not happen, but making the breaks visible, making them part of what you are, rather than evidence of what you lack." Sylvia smiled. She said, "Yes, something very close to that." The Buddha taught that suffering is not the enemy of the spiritual life. It is the teacher, not because suffering is good in itself, but because it is through our contact with suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of others, that compassion becomes possible. A person who has never broken cannot fully understand what it means to be broken. And a person who has not learned to treat their own brokenness with care cannot truly extend that care to anyone else. The gold is not a metaphor for covering over the damage. The gold is the willingness to see it clearly, to say, this is what happened, and to make something of it that would not have been possible without the breaking. Clara sat with this for a long time after she got home. She sat in her kitchen with the paper bag on the table in front of her, the bag with the 4 pieces of the ceramic cup she had not been able to throw away and had not known how to fix. She opened the bag and took out the 4 pieces and arranged them on the table. The break was clean. The 4 pieces, when arranged carefully, still held the shape of the cup. Nothing had been lost except the wholeness of the original form. She looked at the 4 pieces for a long time. Then she ordered a Kintsugi repair kit. It arrived 4 days later. She was not immediately good at it. The first attempt was clumsy, the lacquer too thick in places, the gold dust uneven, the joins visible but not in the way she had hoped. More evidence of inexperience than of intentional beauty. She looked at it and felt the familiar pull of self-criticism, the familiar voice. Not good enough. You should have done this better. Why couldn't you get it right? And then she stopped. She looked at the repaired cup on the table. She looked at the joins, uneven and imperfect and unmistakably handmade. She thought about what Sylvia had said about the case she had been building for her own unworthiness. She thought about how long she had been practicing the art of finding herself insufficient. She thought, I have been doing that for 40 years. I have had considerably more practice at self-criticism than I have at Kintsugi. Of course, the self-criticism is more fluent. It has had more time. She put the cup on her windowsill where she could see it. Over the following months, something began to shift, not dramatically, not in the way that people describe shifts in spiritual narratives, the sudden insight, the complete transformation, the moment everything changed. More like a very slow adjustment in the quality of the light inside a room when you gradually open the blinds over several weeks, each morning a little more than the last, so that the room is never dramatically different from one day to the next, but is, over time, noticeably brighter. She continued to go to the sitting group. She continued to struggle with the metta practice directed at herself. The phrases still felt hollow, still resisted, still produced the particular discomfort of a thing that does not fit the shape it is being asked to fill. But she sat with the discomfort rather than abandoning the practice, and Sylvia had said that sitting with it was the practice, that the discomfort was not a sign of failure, but a sign of contact with the exact place where the work needed to happen. She began to notice the internal commentary, the running evaluation of her own performance that she had never questioned because it had always felt indistinguishable from consciousness itself. She noticed when it fired, and for what, and on what grounds. She noticed that it was almost entirely concerned with what she had not done, what she had done insufficiently, what she should have done differently. She noticed that it never rested. It did not pause when she was tired. It did not stop when she had done something well. It found a way to locate insufficiency in everything, including in the quality of her attempts to locate less insufficiency. She brought this observation to Sylvia one evening. She said, "I have noticed that the inner critic never stops. Even when I do something right, it finds a way to make it not enough. Even this practice, trying to have more self-compassion, the inner critic evaluates my progress at self-compassion and finds it insufficient." Sylvia laughed, not unkindly. She said, "Yes, that is what we are working with." The mind is a very committed instrument. If it has been trained for 40 years in the direction of self-judgment, it will apply that training to everything, including to the project of becoming less self-judgmental. The practice is not to stop the commentary. You cannot stop it by force, any more than you can stop a river by standing in front of it. The practice is to change your relationship to it, to see it as a habit of mind rather than as the truth, to notice it arising and to say, "Ah, there it is again," without immediately believing everything it says. She said, "The Buddha taught that thoughts are not facts. They arise and they pass. What we take to be our most honest self-assessment is often simply our most well-rehearsed story about ourselves. And well-rehearsed is not the same as true." Clara drove home through the early winter dark, the city wet and lit and going about its ordinary business, and she thought about well-rehearsed stories. She thought about the particular story she had been telling herself since approximately the age of 12, the story that said she was not enough and needed to try harder, and the trying harder was never quite sufficient, and the insufficiency was the permanent condition, and the permanent condition was the truth. She thought about how many years she had mistaken the rehearsal for reality. She thought about the cup on the windowsill, imperfect, handmade, repaired with gold that did not pretend the breaking had not happened, still holding what you put into it. Spring came. The sitting group continued. Clara became, over the months, one of the more regular practitioners. Not the most advanced, not the most serene, but consistent in a way that had its own value, showing up Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings with the particular faithfulness of someone who has found something that is doing genuine work and is unwilling to stop before the work is finished. She told Sylvia once, near the end of a Tuesday session, that she was not sure the inner critic had gotten quieter so much as she had gotten less available to it, that she heard it but was less inclined to stop and argue with it, or agree with it, or be flattened by it. That it was more like weather now, present, real, with its own texture and its own effects, but not the same as the sky. Sylvia said, "That is a very precise way to put it. The thoughts are weather. You are the sky." Clara recognized this. It was a teaching from the tradition, rephrased in her own vocabulary, which is what happens when something genuinely lands rather than simply being heard. She had translated it from the tradition into her own language, which was, after all, what she did for a living. The cup on the windowsill caught the morning light differently depending on the season. In summer, the gold in the joins was almost too bright to look at directly. In winter, it was subtler, a warm thread in the gray light, a reminder rather than a proclamation. She had made other things with the Kintsugi kit by then. A small bowl that had slipped from the drying rack, a plate that had been knocked from the counter by the cat she had recently and somewhat reluctantly adopted. Each one imperfect, each one repaired with the same patient attention, the same willingness to let the damage be visible, the same gold. She did not stop being demanding of herself. She did not become someone who found everything she did sufficient. She still cared about the quality of her translations, still spent more time than was strictly necessary finding the right word, still occasionally stayed up too late trying to get something right that no one but her would notice was not quite right. The care was part of who she was, and she had learned to separate it from the punishment, to want to do her work well without treating every imperfection as evidence of a fundamental flaw, to try again without the trying being shadowed by contempt for the previous attempt. This distinction between care and punishment, between standards and cruelty, between the desire to do well and the belief that not doing perfectly meant you had failed, this was what Sylvia had been pointing toward from the beginning. It was what the Metta practice had been clearing the ground for. It was what the Buddha had meant 25 centuries ago when he said that you deserve your own love and affection, not in spite of your imperfections, not after you have fixed them, but as a fundamental fact of your existence prior to any assessment of your performance. She was not done. She did not think of herself as healed or arrived or finished with the work, but she was different in a way she could feel, not in dramatic moments but in the accumulation of small ones. The morning she submitted a translation she knew was not perfect and did not spend the rest of the day punishing herself for it. The afternoon she made a mistake in a conversation and apologized and let it go rather than replaying it for 3 days. The evening she sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea and was simply there, not evaluating the quality of her being there, not measuring the tea against some ideal tea she should have made, not running the background commentary, just there, in the kitchen, in the early evening, in the particular quality of quiet that existed when she stopped filling it with the case for her own insufficiency. She looked at the cup on the windowsill. The gold in the joins caught the last of the afternoon light. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not the absence of the breaking. Not the return to some unbroken original state. The breaking made visible, made part of the object, made into the thing that catches the light. She drank her tea. If you are someone who holds yourself to a standard that you would never apply to anyone you love, if the voice inside your head speaks to you in a language you would never use with a friend, then you are already familiar with the exhaustion that Clara carried for so many years. The constant audit, the running verdict, the sense that you are always on the edge of being found out as someone who has not tried hard enough or cared enough or gotten it right enough. The Buddha's teaching on Metta does not ask you to pretend that the critic is not there. It does not ask you to force a feeling of warmth toward yourself that you do not yet have. It asks something simpler and harder than either of those things. It asks you to be willing to consider that you might deserve the same goodwill you extend to others, to be willing to sit with that possibility even when it does not feel true, even when the habit of self-judgment is louder than the willingness and more familiar and more practiced. The willingness is where it begins, not the arrival, not the completion. The willingness to stay in the room with the possibility, the way Clara stayed in the room with the Metta practice, even when the phrases felt hollow, even when the inner critic found a way to evaluate her progress at self-compassion and declare it insufficient. You are not a project to be completed. You are not a problem to be solved. You are not the story your inner critic tells about you, however long and detailed and well-rehearsed that story has become. You are. This is what the Buddha pointed to. This is what the teaching of compassion rests on. You are the awareness in which the story arises. You are the sky in which the weather moves. And the sky is not improved by the absence of clouds. It is simply the sky, complete in itself, already whole, already here. The breaks do not make you less. If you have found a way to carry them, if you have found a way to show up again and again, despite the places where you came apart, if you have found a way to keep extending care to others, even from the depths of your own unattended wound, then you have already been doing, without knowing it, what the gold in the Kintsugi does. You have been making something of the breaking. You have been letting the damage be part of the structure rather than evidence against it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. May you find the willingness to extend to yourself what you extend so readily to others. May the inner critic's voice become weather rather than verdict. May you find in the places where you are most broken, not evidence of your insufficiency, but the seams where the light gets in. And may you be, as the Buddha said you deserve to be, as you have always deserved to be, at peace. not because you have earned it, not because you have gotten it right, because you are here, because you are alive, because you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your own love and affection. That is where it begins. That is where it has always begun. There is one more thing the Buddha said that is worth sitting with before we close. He said that compassion is not a sentiment. It is not a feeling that arises when conditions are favorable and disappears when they are not. True compassion, karuna in Pali, the word that means not just sympathy, but the active wish to alleviate suffering, is a capacity that can be cultivated, deliberately and systematically, the way any capacity is cultivated. Through practice, through repetition, through the willingness to return to it even when it is difficult, and especially when it is most needed. Most of us understand this when it comes to the people we love. We understand that caring for them is not something we feel only when it is easy. We show up for them when it costs us something, when we are tired, when we would rather be elsewhere, when they have disappointed us or hurt us, or failed to be who we hoped they would be. We understand that this showing up, this continued extension of care beyond the conditions that make care easy, is what love actually is in practice, rather than in theory. What Clara learned over the months and years of her practice was that this same showing up, this same willingness to extend care regardless of conditions, was possible in the relationship she had with herself. That it did not require the inner critic to go silent first. That it did not require her to have fewer flaws or make fewer mistakes or finally reach the standard she had been pursuing her whole life. That it only required the same thing it required in every other relationship: the decision to keep showing up, to extend goodwill not because it has been earned, but because the giving of it is its own foundation. She told Sylvia once, in one of their last conversations before Sylvia moved to another city to teach, that she thought she finally understood what Metta was for. She said, "I used to think it was about generating a feeling, trying to manufacture warmth toward myself that I did not naturally have. But I think it is more like training the direction of attention, practicing looking at myself with the same eyes I use when I look at people I love, not to see something different than what is there, but to see what is there without immediately moving to fix it or judge it or make it mean something about my fundamental worth." Sylvia said, "Yes. The meditation is not changing what you see. It is changing how you see. The object is the same. The quality of the looking is what shifts." Clara sat with that on the plane home. Sylvia had driven her to the airport, a small kindness, the same quality of small kindness as the towel handed to her by a volunteer on a rainy evening that had started all of this. She sat with the quality of the looking. She thought about how many years she had looked at herself through the lens of the case for her own insufficiency, and how the lens had been so familiar that she had not known it was a lens. She had thought she was simply seeing clearly. The quality of the looking changes everything, not what is seen. Not the broken places or the imperfect joins or the translations that are not quite right, or the years in which she had carried her own wound unattended and called it standards. All of that remains. All of it is real and part of the structure of who she is. But the looking, the quality of attention brought to it, that is something over which she has, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of practice, been learning to have some choice. The cup on her windowsill, still there. The joins still gold in the morning light. The history of its breaking still visible and making it, she has come to believe, more itself than it was before. She still makes mistakes. She still submits translations that are not perfect. She still has days when the inner critic is louder than the sky that holds it, when the weather is so persistent that she forgets briefly that she is not the weather. She forgets and then she remembers, and she comes back. She comes back to the breath. She comes back to the body. She comes back to the simple, radical, daily practice of being willing to extend to herself what she would extend without hesitation to anyone she loved. That is the practice. Not completion, not the eradication of the wound, the daily return to the willingness. If you are listening to this and recognizing something of yourself in Clara's story, if the inner critic is a familiar voice, if you know the particular exhaustion of being your own harshest judge, if you have been practicing self-criticism for so long that you have forgotten it is a practice and have begun to mistake it for the truth, then this is what the tradition offers you. Not a solution, not a technique that will make the critic stop, but a different direction to look, a different quality of attention to bring to the very ordinary fact of being a human being who is doing the best they can with what they have in the circumstances they are in on this particular day. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Not after the work is done, not when you have finally gotten it right. Now, here, as you are. This is where it begins. This is also, as it turns out, where it ends, and where it begins again. May you be happy. May you be well. May you be safe. May you be at peace. And if those words feel hollow when you direct them at yourself, if the practice resists, if the familiar voice says you have not yet earned them, then sit with the resistance. Stay in the room with it. Because the resistance is not evidence that the words are not true for you. It is evidence of how long you have believed they were not. And that is the exact place where the work is. That is the exact place where the gold goes. Rest here now, in this breath, in this moment, in the simple, sufficient fact of being here. Broken and repaired and broken again and showing up anyway, which is all any of us are doing, and which is, it turns out, more than enough. More than enough.